Alright guys, so over the last 8 months or so, one of the main justifications that I have seen in order to try to justify the unjustifiable for what Israel has been doing in Gaza is that Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields. And so therefore, what choice does Israel have but to obliterate the healthcare system, the education system, all human life inside of Gaza, etc. Now, here we have a classic example of the phrase that I've repeated throughout the last 8 months on repeat, which is that every accusation is a confession. Here we have the IDF, according to Emmanuel Fabian. The IDF is saying that troops who tied a wounded Palestinian to the hood of a military vehicle in the northern West Bank, not Gaza, under the control of Hamas, but the West Bank under the control of the Palestinian Authority, this morning acted against army protocols. So we skip down here a little bit. For an IDF official response, they say that this action was contrary to orders and procedures. The conduct in this video is not consistent with the IDF's orders and what is expected of its soldiers. Now, do we believe that at face value, given that we have had example after example after example throughout the last number of years of the IDF directly using Palestinians as human shields? I wouldn't believe this at face value, that this is contrary to the orders and procedures of the IDF. But they say the conduct seen in the video is not consistent with the IDF's orders and what is expected of its soldiers. It adds that the incident is being investigated and will be dealt with accordingly. Now, what have we seen over the last 8 months and the years before that from these so-called Israeli internal investigations? Do we ever see any sort of accountability? Do we ever see any sort of, justice in these kinds of situations? Of course not. Of course not. So I wouldn't take that part of it too seriously, but to show you guys what this actually looked like in real time, here we have, it looks like a couple of ambulances, maybe from the Palestinian Red Crescent, I don't know. But here we also have some Israeli military vehicles storming their way through the occupied West Bank. And here on the hood of this vehicle, you see a Palestinian man who has been shot as a part of their operations in the West Bank. And he has since been strapped to the front of this military vehicle to be used explicitly as a human shield, in as literal of a sense as you could possibly imagine. Now, to make things clear for everybody, when Israel says that Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields, let's try to be clear about exactly what they mean. What they're saying is that Hamas operates inside of tunnels and they operate near civilian areas. And so when Israel goes and they bomb a hospital or a refugee camp or a residential building or a church or a mosque or whatever the case may be, as they have tried to justify over the last 8 months of this genocide, what they're saying is that Hamas is in the vicinity and we have no choice but to bomb this location because maybe we'll get a couple of Hamas militants. So when Israel is talking about Hamas using human shields, they're using it in a much more abstract sense, right? They're saying Hamas is in this general vicinity. So that gives us a justification to flatten this apartment building to the ground, which in and of itself, obviously, I would take issue with that kind of logic. Maybe go and do some research in terms of where the IDF has headquarters inside of Tel Aviv, and then, try to ask yourself the question of, well, if Hamas or some Palestinian militant group launched a bunch of rockets towards the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, and they happen to strike the markets that are surrounding this military base, would people then turn around and use the same logic and say, well, Israel shouldn't have been using their civilians as human shields for their military base? I don't think they would use that same kind of an argument if we were talking about the reverse of this kind of a situation. But the main sticking point that I'm trying to get through here is that when we're talking about Hamas using human shields, we're talking about this in very abstract terms. When we're talking about Israel using human shields, we are talking about this in the most literal terms that you could possibly imagine. And this kind of a video that we're looking at on screen right here, this is nothing new, guys. They have been doing this for years. We have examples of the IDF going and doing raids inside of the West Bank, where in some cases, as they're going door to door and trying to go and do some sort of an operation, right, they will literally bring along a Palestinian local to the population that they are going and raiding, and they will hold him in front of the IDF soldiers as they are going in to do this raid, right? So we have seen them use time and time again Palestinians as literal human shields. And what exactly is the outrage from this, right? From the mainstream media? Well, here is pointed out by Asal Rod. How is the media covering this? Well, here from Reuters, Israeli forces strap wounded Palestinian to Jeep during raid, right? Here from CNN, Israeli military straps injured Palestinian man to hood of Jeep. Here from Sky News, Israeli soldiers, again, strapped injured Palestinian to the Jeep after West Bank arrest raid. One more, BBC, Israeli army strapped wounded Palestinian to Jeep. So, as pointed out here by Asal, somehow, immediately, when we get a textbook example of using somebody as a human shield for military purposes, somehow they've all forgotten the phrase human shield. Every single one of these networks, right? Reuters, CNN, Sky News, BBC, they've all somehow forgotten the phrase human shield. Now it's, oh, the IDF strapped a man to the hood of a Jeep. Who knows why they did that? Who knows if that was justified? Meanwhile, if it was the complete reverse of this kind of a situation, imagine, guys, for a second, if Hamas was driving around Gaza in some Jeep with an Israeli hostage strapped to the hood of the vehicle. Imagine that for a second. What do you think the Western media coverage would be in that kind of a situation? Do you think it would be as abstract as this kind of coverage, right? Not really getting to the core of it. Guys, this has been the main argument, the single main argument that I have heard from people defending what Israel is doing inside of Gaza is, well, they have no choice, right? Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields, so of course they have to blow up this elementary school. Of course they have to attack this UN refugee camp. Of course they have to attack this mosque or this church or whatever the case may be. This is the main argument that they use to attack Hamas. Look at how evil and barbaric and savage Hamas is, that they would use Palestinians as a human shield. But then when it comes to Israel, doing the same fucking thing. Nothing. Nothing. It's this abstract terminology. Oh, we got strapped to it. Well, they confirmed the incident took place, the incident, right? And admitted that its forces, they violated military protocol. They violated military protocol. So what exactly is going to come from that? Is there going to be any sort of accountability? Right? Is there going to be any consequences? No, of course not. Of course there won't be. Right? Now, a couple other things that I wanted to mention in this video before we move on here. Here from President Biden. So this is on a totally different situation. This is happening here in the United States. I think there are a couple of events like this happening inside of Canada as well. So basically what we have, and this is not a joke, guys. I wish it was a fucking joke. This is not a joke. We have synagogues here in the United States and in Canada as well that have been conducting essentially auctions for stolen Palestinian land. Stolen Palestinian land inside of Jerusalem as well as the West Bank, right? So under international law, this is totally illegal. Under U.S. domestic law, this is totally illegal. You have synagogues that are basically offering up specifically to one ethnic group here in the United States, that being Jewish Americans. They are offering them stolen Palestinian property at auctions that are being held at U.S. synagogues. I wish this wasn't the case. I wish this wasn't actually happening. Now, because this has been happening, you have obviously had protests that have taken place outside of these kinds of events. Now, at some of these events, you have seen some forms of violence that have sprung up. Now, I'm not going to say that this is 100% the case across the board, but from what I have seen, much of the violence, surprise, surprise, similar to what we saw with the protests on college campuses here across the United States, it seems like much of the violence is coming from the pro-Israel side. It's coming from the pro-Zionism side. Now, here was just one example. I'm not even going to play this video because I don't want to dignify them. But there was a video, and I'll link this down below if you want to go fact check me, where the pro-Israel side was saying, quote, sand N-words, go home. Sand, N-words, go home. That was one of the chants that they were using at this sort of protest, counter-protest. So, we now have President Joe Biden stepping into this situation, and he says, quote, "I'm appalled by the scenes outside of Adas Torah Synagogue in Los Angeles. Intimidating Jewish congregants is dangerous, unconscionable, anti-Semitic, and un-American." He says Americans have a right to peaceful protests, but blocking access to a house of worship and engaging in violence is never acceptable. First off, engaging in violence, from what I've seen at least, much of the violence was coming from the Zionist side of this equation, right? So that's number one. Number two, are you actually going to try to fucking sit here and to say that the reason that these people were protesting these events is because this was a synagogue? You're actually going to try to say that this was some sort of like an anti-Semitic hate mob that was attacking this synagogue because they were engaging in Jewish prayer? Is that what we're saying here? It has nothing to do with the fact that the event they were hosting at this synagogue was to sell stolen, illegally stolen, mind you, Palestinian property. Has nothing to do with that. No condemnation of that. Keep in mind, guys, again, these kinds of events should be considered not only totally illegal under international law, because these settlements in the occupied West Bank are totally illegal, but it should also be considered illegal under U.S. civil rights law, because these events are exclusive to one specific ethnic group here in the United States, Jewish Americans, who, according to Israeli law, have a right to go and to live in the occupied West Bank. They have a right to become Israeli citizens, right? So this should be illegal on two different fronts, internationally and domestically, here in the United States. Now, instead of cracking down on these events for being flagrantly illegal on multiple different levels, he's coming out and attacking the protesters of these events and saying that they're basically an anti-Semitic, un-American, dangerous, unconscionable hate mob. That's Joe Biden's characterization of the protests that have taken place over the last couple of days. This is fucking insane, guys. How insane is this, right? I mean, to me at least, you look at a situation like this, and it's like, what do we think is going to come from this? What good do we think is possibly going to come from this? Now we move on, because there's a couple other things that I wanted to mention in this video. Here we have from, John McCain's wife, Cindy McCain, who's the head of the World Food Program. And she said this recently, just a couple of days ago on June 20th. "Our trucks are supposedly deconflicted," meaning that they're supposed to be recognized by Israel as these are not targets for you. And she says, "But that hasn't stopped the Israelis from blowing tank rounds through our walls." Blowing tank rounds through our walls. So this is just one other testimony, right, from Cindy McCain, mind you, right? And this is just one other testimony on the endless onslaught that we have seen over the last 8 months on the ability for the Gazan people to receive aid. We've seen this with the strike on the World Central Kitchen workers, where numerous aid workers were struck. They were supposed to be in a deconflicted zone. They were struck not once, not twice, but 3 separate times in drone strikes. We've seen this with the flower massacre that then turned into multiple flower massacres after the fact, where hundreds of Palestinians were killed and wounded who were desperately trying to go and seek aid. We've seen this kind of thing over and over and over again, guys. This has been the single deadliest war, the deadliest conflict, the deadliest genocide in modern history for aid workers, period. So this is something that the Joe Biden administration, that the Israeli government has been fully complicit in this entire way. From the outset, since October 7th, we saw the Israeli government. They came out, they said, we're going to do a full siege on Gaza. We're cutting off the food, the water, the electricity, everything. We're cutting it all off. And then surprise, surprise, as they've been arbitrarily restricting aid from getting into Gaza for 8 months now, you have a famine in the northern portion of Gaza. Then we have the Joe Biden administration, who not only hasn't been doing anything about the fact that Israel has been blocking the aid from getting in, but then goes out of his way to construct a bullshit PR stunt Gaza coast pier that falls apart in a couple of weeks. And since Joe Biden started the process of constructing that pier off the coast of Gaza that was supposedly going to deliver a bunch of aid to the people of Gaza, since he started that process, less aid has been getting into Gaza. Less, not more, less than beforehand. So it was a PR stunt, but worse than that, it was a pathetic attempt to cover up from the fact that the Israeli government is intentionally, as a tactic of war, trying to starve the population of Gaza. And that's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of major human rights organizations. It's the opinion of major UN experts on this issue that have been tracking this closely. Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. And this is one other further sort of like tab that we can keep track of in that effort that they have been engaging in. Now, one final thing, because of course we also had an additional Israeli strike on tent camps near Rafah. This time they killed 25 and wounded 50, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. So at what point is this Joe Biden red line in Rafah going to kick in? At what point? Does it take 100 deaths, 200 deaths, 300 deaths, 400 deaths, 1,000 deaths, 10,000 deaths? What exactly is the red line? Because remember, Joe Biden initially said going into Rafah is the red line. Then he said a major military operation is the red line. And then Israel proceeded to bomb literally dozens of innocent civilians in refugee camps in Rafah, in places that they told them were safe zones. So then what exactly is the red line? The answer is that there's no red line. There is no red line. Now, I mean, I've obviously been tracking this stuff a lot over the last 8 months, and I've seen this happen over and over and over again. Joe Biden has no end to this. I need you guys to understand. Joe Biden is ideologically a Zionist. He ideologically cannot remove himself from being paired to whatever Israel wants to do in any given situation. He is refusing time and time again to hold them accountable, to put them in their place, to use the levers of power that he has at his disposal, right? He's done this time and time again. He would prefer to have the leader of Israel, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, come out repeatedly and humiliate him on the global stage, while also putting in jeopardy American national security interests at the same time by edging us closer to a war with Hezbollah and a war with Iran. He would rather allow Bibi to do that than to apply pressure on Israel publicly in order to stop the genocide and to stop the escalation towards a broader regional war. That's the current humiliating status that we are facing right now.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying